Hello boys and girls, Navinat on No Limit Hold'em here. Today we're going to be talking about starting hand selection in No Limit Hold'em, and specifically where the value comes from in starting hands that we play and why we choose to play them. Understanding where the value comes from post-flop is going to help you choose the way you want to play each hand pre-flop. And the main factors that will allow you to pull value out of post-flop spots, the main way you're going to create profit after the flop with your pre-flop starting hands: domination, nut potential, synergy, showdown value. Domination is it's in reference to the hands that are going to dominate, and just the very common definition of dominate other hands, right? Your ace king, your pocket aces, what most people call premiums. It can be queens plus and ace king in some situations, or in other situations it might be jacks plus and ace queen plus. Maybe king queen suited to a slightly lesser degree is going to have some domination rating. It's really dependent on the situation. Nut potential. Nut potential is the relatively okay chance of making a really monster good hand, right? Synergy. Synergy is the same thing as connectivity. I like to call it synergy. I like talking about it. I like thinking about it. I like working with it. I find like a lot of the hands that are like at the cusp ends of my ranges tend to be there or not be there because of their synergistic qualities. And showdown value. Showdown value is your pocket pairs have inherent showdown value. The bigger the pair, the more showdown value it tends to have. Ace highs have some showdown value. You get down to king high, and yeah, maybe you can still win some pots unimproved, but you get below that and it starts to fade pretty fast. But mostly we're talking about pocket pairs and ace highs. But showdown value is just your ability to win a pot without improving your hand. It comes up somewhat pre-flop when you're kind of deep stacked, especially with your pocket pairs. Well, for example, pocket twos. If you're thinking about taking a set line with pocket twos do not have a tremendous amount of inherent showdown value, because they're just very rarely going to allow you to call a bet at any spot unless you improve. So pocket twos don't have a tremendous amount of showdown value, but pocket sevens kind of do have some showdown value. So if you're in a spot where you're thinking about taking a set line or not, one of the things you might want to think about, if it's close as to whether you have the nut potential to do it, is to think about or consider your showdown value along with it, and you might just find that you've got enough value to make the call. Blockers and board coverage are secondary considerations that I don't want to get into a lot here, but I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be, maybe it's worth discussing at least a little bit, or at least just throwing a slide out here. Read this. This isn't what we're talking about in this video, so I'm going to move on. But we're talking about how to pull value and how to create money and profit from our starting cards. So I thought it would be remiss of me not to at least put a slide up. Moving right along, back to domination value. This is the cool stuff that we're talking about in this video. Hands with high domination value prefer less opponents and often play best heads up. They're generally going to do better with a lower stack to pot ratio, because that's going to help them to avoid losing too much money to the more speculative hands when their opponents that are playing the more speculative hands happen to get there on them. So basically you're going to help to avoid reverse implied odds, but at the same time keeping good implied odds against the second best hands that are going to call your aggressive actions pre-flop. They're going to play better against hands that are likely to continue against your aggression than they would against hands that would be in other more passive ranges that would prefer to see cheaper flops. Example, villain on the button open raises with 7-6 suited or ace-queen offsuit. That's his range. You have ace-king offsuit. You should 3-bet it. Why? Because you don't mind folding out 7-6 suited or making the stack to pot ratio smaller. In fact, even if your opponent has a hand as weak as like 5-4 suited or 7-6 offsuit and opens the button, I think we probably do better 3-betting ace-king offsuit and just folding our opponent's equity out than taking ace-king offsuit against 7-6, because ace king offsuit does not dominate 7-6. So if you know your opponent's going to fold a lot of his garbage hands, but he's never going to fold a hand like ace jack, ace queen, ace 10 suited, king queen, king jack suited, then 3-betting ace king has an awful lot of value, right? Because your hand not only is going to win more often at showdown against the hand that it dominates, but you're going to be in some very good implied odds situations against hands that you dominate, where the reverse implied odds are more coming your way when you're up against a hand like a suited connector and you've got one of these dominant hands. So all of these things mean that we should probably err towards aggression with our hands that we're playing mostly for their domination. Nut potential. When we're talking about playing a hand primarily for its nut potential, we're talking about implied odds. If we're relying on implied odds for profitability, then we're talking about how much does it cost us to get involved in this situation and how much can we get out of this situation when things go our way, multiplied by how often that happens, right? So we really don't have a lot of incentive to push other opponents out or to shrink the stack to pot ratio. Our hands are going to tend to hit hard enough or not at all, but when they do hit hard, they're going to hit hard enough to play pretty well. And when, well, I'll just put it this way, when you flop a set, you're almost as likely to beat 3 opponents as you are to beat 1 opponent, but you have that many more opportunities to get paid off because there's more opponents in there, so there's a better chance that somebody's going to make a good second best hand to pay you with. Now, the stack to pot ratio scenario is a little bit weird when you're thinking about this concept, because a lot of players, I think, have it in their minds that it's bad to have a low stack to pot ratio when you're talking about set mining. And in general, it kind of is, but that's because the general way you get to a low SPR is like an opponent raises and you 3-bet and he 4-bets, and you're thinking about taking a set mine with like pocket 9s at this point, and your stack to pot ratio sucks. Well, that's not the same thing as one guy raises, you call, and half the table calls along. That's not the same situation. There, you have extra pot odds, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, right? So, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but we'll just say a low SPR is not a big plus. It's really all about pot odds and implied odds, and when we do hit, we hit hard enough to beat most of the players at the table if they called, right? So all this ought to tip us towards playing more passively. Synergy, connectivity. Synergy and connectivity allow us to hit flops in different ways. So we have different ways to go when we've got synergistic hand combos. So our hand's going to be more versatile. It's going to play well heads up. It's going to play well multi-way. We can use it as a semi-bluffing hand and get aggro with it. It's going to be a good hand for c-betting and barreling with, but it's also going to generate massive, massive implied odds when we cooler one of these hands that is like a nut potential hand, like a set, that not only when we do actually hit our draws, when we have these synergistic connected hands, like suited connectors, when we hit those hands, they're not only going to beat the top pair weak kicker or top pair second kicker, top pair mediocre kicker that the dominating value hands are value targeting, but we're also going to beat those hands, the hands that the sets are value targeting, and we're going to beat the sets themselves. So the implied odds here are monstrous, of course. So depending on our opponent, sometimes it's a very good idea to play synergistic hands aggressively, and some hands, or rather sometimes, against certain opponents, it's better to play them for their implied odds, and that's going to change a lot of things about where we put them in our ranges and how we play them. But it's really one of the coolest things in my mind about these hands, and it's one of the things that I think is really talked about so rarely, but is probably implicit in the way most players construct their ranges. If you look at the hands that some players are going to, like really good players are going to sometimes play as an open raise from whatever position and sometimes not, it's mostly these hands. If you think about the hands that some players are going to 3-bet with and some people are going to flat call with and other players are going to just fold, a lot of it's going to do with synergy, and I think a lot of that comes down to how well the player feels he can, how good a job the player who's constructing his 3-betting range feels like he can do at playing against the weaknesses of the opponents they're playing against, because that's where synergy shines, man. It allows you to take aggressive lines against players that fold too much, and you can be in the same exact spot and take a like check call line and hope to get there against a hand that, you know, maybe doesn't bet his hands aggressively enough and can't fold when he hits something. So like consider going to the flop however you got there with 9-8 suited and flopping an open-ended straight flush draw against a tighter player, or like a nit, a tag. You can play that pretty aggressively and maybe like check raise the flop, bomb the turn, and jam the river, and he can just like never call you. But against a like calling station payoff wizard type player that doesn't bet his hands often enough for value or as a bluff, but he has a real hard time folding anything, then, you know, now we're going to play our hand for our implied odds. So the synergy is a little bit different than the other factors in that your opponent is going to determine the way that you're going to be best able to make money. Showdown value, or you can also look at this as hot cold race equity, helps you win small pots unimproved. It can make for good short stack shoves. It can tie break when you're deciding between calling or folding in spots, especially with set mining. Like if a player opens up in middle position, he's a good opponent. You're not that deep, and you're in the big blind considering taking a set mine. Maybe pocket twos is a fold, but maybe pocket sevens is a call, and it's all because of the extra showdown value that you have with the pocket sevens. I mean, also, I guess occasionally you'll overset somebody with sevens and you'll never overset them with deuces, but mostly it's because you're going to win just a couple more pots when you can peel the flop and your opponent gives up with his ace king and you win at showdown, or something like that happens. So being able to check down and win occasionally, peel a street, bluff catch, all of this adds value at normal depths, and the race equity that they have makes these hands start playing pretty well again when you get into the like late stages of a tournament where you're short stacked and going for a shove, because they can win unimproved, which puts the onus on your opponent to try to catch up. Final thoughts here. When we're talking about a spot where we feel like we should have an ISO raising range and we should be overlimping some hands, tend to ISO the hands that have good domination rating, like two big cards or a medium to big size pocket pair. So if we're in this spot where villain open limps from middle position and we're in the cutoff seat, and we feel like we should have some ISO raises and some over limps, and that won't always be the case, but let's just imagine that we're in a spot where we feel like that's the best strategy. If we are going to ISO raise some hands, if the hands that we're thinking about ISO raising could kind of go either way, if the opponents that we're thinking about getting aggressive against may fold enough pre-flop or on the flop to a single barrel, or they might not, then these things should tip you over the edge, either putting a hand squarely or firmly in your overlimping range, or pulling it into the hands that you probably ought to ISO raise with. So if you have a hand that is likely to dominate the hands, some of the hands or a lot of the hands that your opponent would likely limp in with and then call a raise, then you've got a great domination rating in this spot, and you should tend to play aggressively. If you're in a spot where you've got good nut potential, and you're thinking you're better off playing for implied odds, maybe your opponents aren't really good at folding, then that should tip you towards overlimping. So in general, you should play your nut potential hands as overlimps in these spots, and you should play your hands that have good domination rating as ISO raises. Blocker effects should probably tip the scales a little bit towards an ISO, and synergy should usually tip the scale a little bit towards overlimping, but that depends on the opponent. Now, when you would like to have a flat calling range and a 3-bet range in some spot pre-flop, you should always be thinking about these things, right? Where does the value come from in starting hands? And if you're going to 3-bet some hands and you're going to flat call others in a given spot, you should tend to 3-bet hands with good domination rating, tend to call with hands that have good nut potential. You should kind of mix it up with the synergistic hands. It really depends on your opponents. And, having a little extra synergy, a little extra connectivity, a suited connector that's maybe just good enough to flat call with, might make for a better 3-bet. If it's at the bottom of your flatting range, 3-betting it in position can only be so bad. But just considering how your opponent's going to react to your 3-bets, and how he's going to react to your C-bets, and how he's going to react to your double barrels, and triple barrels, and so on and so forth, that's the kind of thing that should break the tie. Sometimes you should be playing Queen-Jack suited for its top pair potential. Sometimes you should be playing it for its suited connectedness, for making big hands. And hopefully, thinking about these things will get you constructing your ranges just a little tiny bit better.